started, and maybe people will trickle in as we get moving into the meeting. This meeting is being held on the traditional unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples, and the meeting is being live streamed. Just to remind you, and that the audio and video recording will also be available to the public for viewing after the meeting. Footage of the meeting may be viewed inside and outside of Canada. And just a reminder, I mean, we know this, but we'd like to emphasize it through each meeting. The board has a real commitment to meeting decorum and to ethical conduct. This includes the responsibility of the committee members to conduct themselves in an appropriate decorum and professionalism. And as chair of the committee, it is my responsibility to see that the decorum is maintained. So we're going to start off on number 1 with delegations. There are no delegations. So we're on to number 2 with the item informations, and Deputy Superintendent David Nelson will be talking about some of the AP administrative procedures manual update.
Thank you, Chair Valentine. Thank you everyone for coming. The first report, item 2.1, is a summary of the latest work that's been undertaken by the Administrative Procedures Working Group. This group, as you may recall, was formed to undertake the task of modernizing and revising our Administrative Procedures Manual following the adoption of the new policy manual and policy handbook and Administrative Procedures Manual by the board. So we had identified at that time a number of administrative procedures, had been previous policies, and those were outdated and required modernizing and revising. So it's been quite an undertaking. This is our binder of admin procedures we've been revising and updating, and this is the latest group of admin procedures that we're reporting out on. So just by way of really quickly background to remind everyone, the board policy handbook, policy 12 requires and mandates the superintendent to be responsible for keeping the Administrative Procedures Manual current and ensuring that it's consistent with board policy as well as provincial regulations and procedures. There have been a number of reports previously to the Policy and Governance Committee in regard to the work that's been undertaken to update the Administrative Procedures Manual. Most of the ones that are all referenced here on 3rd, December 5th, and February 6th. So on February 20th, there was a meeting of the Admin Procedures Working Group to continue the work that has been undertaken. And at that group and through the work of that group, a number of additional updates have been made to the Administrative Procedures Manual. So these are listed under revisions to Administrative Procedures Manual, and they are contained in the staff report. So for your information, the ones that following this meeting will be updated in our online manual are listed there, but they include Parent Advisory Councils, District Parent Advisory Council, Smoke-Free Environment, Board Authority courses, disputes regarding parent access to students, reimbursement of travel expense reimbursement, and personal mileage reimbursement, as well as 2 appendixes, 490A, volunteer guidelines, and 490B, guidelines for volunteer coaches. I want to just note that both of these 2 appendices had previously been long-standing district procedures, but because we now have an admin procedures manual, we felt they should be incorporated into that. So they were reviewed by the committee, and they are now appendices to AP 490 volunteers in schools. So attached to this report again is the February 6th policy and governance report for your information, as well as those updated administrative procedures. So that, by way of a report, we'll turn it back to the chair. Yes, go ahead.
So David, I know we had discussed this, and I'm sorry, I can't remember what we had landed on, but the notion that this be sort of an ongoing group that we weren't left 10 years from now having to revise them all over again. So there was a sense of if stakeholders felt there were admin procedures, I know we talked about gifts, for example, that's still under discussion, but if there are admin procedures that stakeholders felt should be there or should be deleted or changed, what was the way we were going to do that, or have we come up with a decision on that?
So through the chair, I believe we did speak about it. My foggy in my memory, but I do believe we spoke about it at our last meeting, and my intent really was to bring it back to our next meeting.
Okay.
We do need to get it scheduled.
Okay.
And to bring back to this committee a recommendation on that. But my personal feeling would be it's been very effective and very. So I would like to have maybe not meet as regularly, but some ongoing group that could review and provide feedback. Staff perspective has been great.
Yes, Chair, I just have a question specifically as it relates to the Parents Advisory Councils. I don't know if this came up in the review of that policy, but I understand that there are still schools that don't have PACs. Is there a sense of how many, and maybe Sean can answer that? And I'd also be curious, second part to that, what can be done to really kind of encourage so that we actually have a PAC, that's on each school, so that those parental voices are being heard? Maybe a strategy or two that you may try to use, or that the school board can to address, and if that I don't see that somewhere in here, like as an administrator, but I just feel it's a valuable thing to encourage.
Sean?
Through the chair. It's a great question. I think over the last 3 years, we've actually tried to have contact with every school and every district. And I believe we have, with maybe the exception of a very small handful. I believe at this point, we're probably only down to, I'd say, less than 5 schools that don't have PACs, or functional PACs, I should say. Most schools have some semblance of a PAC. Some are at different stages. Some are very established and very well functioning. Some are nascent and still trying to get their feet off the ground. I think there's very few PACs that don't. So there are a few schools that don't have PACs at this point. I don't have an exact number. Yeah, all the tiered schools have PACs. I know from our meeting last week on Treasury 101, there may be one school that I got a wind of that maybe doesn't have a functional PAC right now. And that was quite well represented meeting. Back to you with an exact number.
I think it's really important, and I don't know if it's something that needs to be mandated, that there has to be some of a PAC, but I just feel that if there isn't, then there's just that loss of connection that parents have potentially right through that came up.
You Chair, that specific topic did not come out. Certainly, Sean has schools that are struggling or identified. I would certainly be interested to hear, because we work with our school-based principals and the support we provide them, because sometimes it is a matter of parents are very busy, and so certainly there may be a way to help support them in being able to form, because I would agree it's very important, critical feature of school function.
It's that equity piece that I think is lacking, right, if it's not properly sensitive. I would appreciate that. I'd love to know more.
Through the chair, I actually think on the equity side, that's a very important part. It's one of the key sources of funding for any school is their gaming, which has to be done through the PAC. So I'll definitely try to get a list of any that don't have functioning PACs, and generally that gating piece is how we measure functioning. And I can bring it back to the next meeting.
Janet?
I know that there's been an extraordinary amount of work done on the administrative procedures. Do you have a sense of, I think the intent was to review all of them by the end of June. Do you have a sense of the timeline for that is if we're on schedule for that?
Yeah, so through your chair, we've made amazing progress. I'm actually going to hesitate to commit that we'll absolutely complete it, because we wanted it to be a process that has been where we reach through and really heard all the voices, but this thanks to my colleague Linda Bond. Can't see it, I know, but this is our tracking document of the ones that have been flagged. And so we've kept really good track. There are about, I look at the ones to still be completed. Looks like we have very few left. So I would say after this group, there's 1, 2, it might be down to 2 that were flagged as needing review in an urgent manner. And then we've of course started to turn our attention as a committee to areas where we didn't have admin procedures. So we've been doing both urgent, and we've addressed all of the ones flagged by our stakeholders, and flagged for having really egregious language that we wanted to clean up. But I would say to Catherine's earlier point, there are a lot of admin procedures, and to keep this current, this group really will need to, or the staff, this has to be an ongoing year. So we will come to an end point this year where I will feel pretty satisfied that yes, to your point, we've done what we set out to do, but there is still going to be work going on. Otherwise, we'll be recommending.
I guess that's the sort of point I was trying to dig into a little bit. So are we ready to make that transition from doing a huge amount of work to process?
Yeah, so for each other, the answer will be yes.
Yes, again, through the chair, I know I brought this up before with the smoke-free environment, the fact that the vaping wasn't part of that. And I understand there was going to be a separate policy. Is that still the plan, or has that been, is it in the pipeline to come up soon, or?
So through the chair, Administrative Procedure 162 has and does now include use of vaporizers. So they are, it outlines in here that basically it's not allowed on the school grounds or property.
And that's it. This is where this guy.
Well, I would say the next piece is in around how that actually gets implemented, which is more of an issue, I think, but this policy clearly says there is to be no use of vapes or vaporizing on school.
Jen?
Just curious about the language around parents and guardians in the administrative procedures. I'm used to seeing it parents/guardians or parents and guardians, but I think in reading one of them, there's a definition of a parent that includes guardians. Is that maybe I'm showing my age a little bit, is that sort of the new world we live in?
Yeah, so through the chair, I can answer, but I would really prefer my colleague Linda Bond, who does this work, provide a better answer than.
So the legal definition of parent changed as part of the Family Law Act 2014. So parent is now considered a guardian by birth, court order, or adoption. So if you are a parent by court order, birth, or adoption, you are the guardian. In the previous legislation, parent and guardian not considered the same thing. Under the Family Law Act, they are. That's why references to parent/guardian have been removed. Parent, you're the guardian.
Sean?
Through the chair, that matches up with, it looks like changes in the school act around the definition of parent as well. So it should be covered through that too.
And I will say, Chair, there is going to be instances in the admin procedures. So some of the just housekeeping stuff that we will do is we still need to do a thorough search for gender identifying language in all procedures, and we'll do that as that kind of year-end exercise. We will just back here because it's really just housekeeping. We'll go through clean up wherever it's. She's vague, right? So that we'll just do a general clean on that.
I have a question actually that spawns from that. I've noticed they looked at the language around the coaches volunteers. This is jump and shifting volunteer file. and the guidelines around it, and I've read it pretty closely, and I think it's pretty airtight for the coaches. But I'm thinking specifically of an issue in one of our high schools where a parent or guardian wasn't allowed to represent the gender that wasn't represented. Like there was two coaches, one was a coach and one was a parent who was helping out in a debate team. And this is such a stellar debate team that they go to the nationals and win. And so, but the costs are becoming prohibitive for the school because you're sending, you're having to send 3 adults with, say, 6 kids, not necessarily 10 or 12 like a team. But so, and I'm just wondering if there's any language that can be in there to give some discretion to the principal to allow a parent of kids to be kind of like a chaperone to represent, you know, in this case, the female gender.
Chair, I'm not entirely sure. So I do know, maybe I'm not going to answer question, I'll do this. I do know that in our policy, overnight studies require someone of the same gender as the students who are attending. Linda, please correct me if I'm wrong. So if it is a school trip attended by both male and female students, you would require a chaperone, both a male and a female chaperone to attend, regardless of the numbers on the
Language
trip.
in there and allows the students to rely on the so that also procedure. But policy does require a staff member to be in attendance and for that staff member to be supported by a parent or volunteer, but we must have a staff. Don't have extracurricular opportunities on a basis that are just non-staff members, which I think is what.
The teacher didn't want to be, in this case, the teacher's sponsors, but they're not necessarily interested in traveling to Ottawa or to Montreal and give up a weekend. So the parents were wanting to be, that's why, and of course the principal was feeling, you know, I just wanted to know if there was language that would allow the principal to sort of have some leeway, but not overnight. It's a hard and fast policy.
Yeah, Chair, if it's a school-sponsored event, our requirement is that there are staff that are in attendance. Certainly, families can send children to opportunities that are not sponsored by the school, and we have had experiences with certain programs where schools, where groups of parents decide to organize something separate of the school, but then it's not a school event. So these pertain to school activities, school-sponsored activities.
I just hate to see our schools not be recognized for the kids and the hard workers too, because you can't get sponsors, staff out who parents are willing to stand up and pay to support those kids. Anyways, okay, thank you. Any other girls have any comments on any of the? Okay, thank you very much. Oh, the draft naming guiding principles. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So it's a pleasure to be presenting this tonight. This has been a process that's been undertaken, and I acknowledge that it's taking longer than we originally had identified. But again, I think we speak for the working group in saying that we feel quite strongly that to do this well, we want to take time to get it right. So this is a report on the progress of the working group. And this report provide what would be some draft guidelines or considerations that have been developed at this point by the working group. In terms of at this time we're dealing with and decided to focus on naming of new facilities because we wanted to separate out naming from. We recognize that we have work to do still on renaming, and the school may already have a name, but this is dealing with a new facility. And this report is provided at this time for discussion purposes. So I will go through it, and then I'm hoping that the chair will facilitate an open discussion of what's in here. Just prior to doing that, though, I do want to recognize Chaz as our district vice principal, and she is here. And so she's pleased. Actually, Chaz, if you want to join us at the table for this, that would be great. And just because you can add any perspectives as well. Lori, I know I can't have you because you're not officially a member, but I do want to acknowledge that you're an honor. Helpful for you to hear. And Linda, of course, helped. Okay, so on February 26th, the board proposed the motion that's there for to implement a process to revise what at the time were policies FF and FFC, naming of new facilities and renaming of existing school facilities with the goal of better representing the city's multicultural heritage and towards commitment to reconciliation. So there was a June 6th staff report that was presented that outlined the process and the time for revising the naming and policies. And these subsequently have been converted in their form as policies to APs. And Sean had asked me earlier, they're included for your information, but no revisions have been made to them yet. So they're strictly there for backup at this point. So the renaming and renaming working group came out of a June 24th, where there was a recommendation to form a working group to bring back to the committee some guidelines that could be used to redraft the two admin procedures, 541 and 541A. I just want to acknowledge the working group is comprised of Menlan Castro from DPAC, Madeline Brewster from Vancouver Secondary Teachers, Dan Phillips representing Secondary School Admin, Allison Jambor, Elementary School Admin, Lori Croden. That's right. Allison Jambor, Elementary School Teachers, and Lori Croden, Elementary Principal, as well as Chaz, myself, and Linda. I won't go through all of these, but I've provided a chronology of some of the work in the meetings that have taken place. One of the ones I do want to highlight on January 17th, the work group traveled to Musqueam to meet with Jill and Vanessa Campbell of the Musqueam Language Department. And the meeting was fascinating and so enlightening, and the summary here hardly does it justice. The things that I personally learned and took away from there. But some of the key things are summarized here and were discussed subsequently by our committee when we met on February 27th. So at that time, we brainstormed. We actually did an exercise where everyone had sticky notes and we put down what we heard and thought and felt. And then I took them away and kind of summarized them, we categorized them together, and I took it away and summarized it. And with Chaz's help, she met with Musqueam to go over them again prior to this report going out to make sure that what was in this report accurately reflected their feelings, their thoughts, and what they shared with us. And so before I go through them, next steps are that the naming and renaming group following tonight's meeting will be on April 28th to review any feedback we received tonight. And to start to have an initial look at that point as to what a revision to the admin procedure based on what we heard tonight and in relation to these guiding principles direction we've heard would look like. And then once complete that 541, once complete draft revision to 541 reviewed by the admin procedures working group, which we spoke about earlier. So both working groups will be involved. It would go there next for them to have feedback and input. And then once revisions were complete or are complete, they would be of course approved by the superintendent and reported back out to this committee. So once revisions to AP 541 are complete, the naming and renaming working group will begin the work of looking at guidelines and an admin procedure for the renaming of existing school facilities. I'm going to turn back to page 3 of the report, and I want to go over the draft naming considerations. We really are hoping to get some feedback, either whatever it should be tonight from this group. So the first is recognizing that place-based names, although not traditionally used for buildings in Indigenous culture, has been an Indigenous practice since time immemorial. New school names should be place-based. Place-based names should be meaningful and reflect the significant geography of the area. This recognizes that the relationship of the school building to the land is important. As it's acceptable for school to be given both an English and a Hunkaminam, I said that. Name, dual naming shall be considered in naming the school. If when selecting a place-based name that acknowledges Indigenous history, it's important to seek early involvement of Musqueam elders in the process. And an education and communication plan should be developed and implemented to support understanding the history and significance of this new school name and to teach proper pronunciation of any name given. And I'm going to go back to St. Hunkaminam because one of the things I most learned, many things I learned was both Jill and Vanessa were really clear that we have to get over our fear of saying it wrong and to give ourselves permission to say the Hunkaminam names incorrectly, because we will never move forward in embracing this language, not the language, but this Indigenous language if we don't allow ourselves as speakers to make mistakes. So I'm going to continue to say it, even though I hesitated. I was going to say, Chaz, can you say it? But that's not okay. So that is my report, and really it's achieved for any discussion or feedback.
Oh, great.
Yes, so thank you for this, and it is exciting. The Vancouver Park Board has embarked on a very dynamic reconciliation process. They are looking at renaming spots around the city, and I know hired Indigenous staff to work with them, very engaged in it. So Madeline Brewster, who's the VSTA rep, did bring it back to our executive, and it was discussed, and some questions came out of it from some of our exec members. And it's a question, just curious, given that we acknowledge that we are Musqueam, Coast Salish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, and certainly when I look at the Vancouver Park Board initiative, it involves those 3 communities. So it's really just a question, will the Tsleil-Waututh and Coast Salish nations be involved in the discussion also around the renaming and naming process, and what their take on that would be.
So thank you for that. So can I ask Chair, because we're in discussion, I don't know how that works, if we have to do the formal thing, because we can be a little more loose than our formal process. I don't know what the process, we haven't had a discussion item at these, so I was hoping we had more of a dialogue than a.
Yeah.
Is that
That's fine.
Chair? Okay, so can I ask Chaz to address that, because that did come up at our team, our working group.
So any of the schools in which the VSB reside on, Musqueam territory, would be respectful protocol, work with them directly first. Unless, they do have crossover boundaries, but most of our schools are Musqueam territory, so we have not yet reached out to Tsleil-Waututh or Squamish, because we don't have any, how it's very, takes a long time to build relationships that are trusting relationships. And it's a very good question, but since most of our schools reside on Musqueam territory, Musqueam first. And so we've been building that relationship over the last, years and moving along. And and we would want, if they're place-based, these names, have a long history and Musqueam history, right? So we could go to the elders to seek, and if they would recommend, if there was, one of our schools are on the periphery of, where the boundaries cross over, then that's when we would seek guidance from their protocol or from their elders. Then we would do what they, if that was their wishes, for us to do some cross consultation with Tsleil-Waututh or Squamish. But
Thank you for that. It's a great backfill.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Go ahead. Sure.
Thank you very much. So that's very useful to take back to our executive, and I know sometimes knowing where the traditional territories, there's sometimes differing accounts of where that is. Is it possible at some point to have a map so that, just out of curiosity, that we know which schools reside on Musqueam land and perhaps which schools reside on land where maybe clear? Not that I imagine we're going to change the names of Vancouver either, but it would just be really interesting.
I mean, I would have to go to Musqueam and speak to their elders and see what sort of archives they have there that pertain to boundaries. I myself, I'm not I mean, I've talked to community members and have a general idea, but yeah, I mean, that would be something that would be helpful. I mean, there are maps out there, but they're not, 100% accurate, and different nations have different perspectives as to where those true boundaries are, right? So it's always going to be, some sort of gray area discussion as to whose territory it is, but Vancouver resides on it. So, but it's something that we could definitely look at.
Janet?
Thank you, Fraser. In reading this report, it's evident a lot of thought has gone into underway. And looking at the draft naming considerations and comparing that to the current administrative procedure, I think it would be a fairly significant change in the way that we do the business of the district. So I'm wondering if part of the discussion could be which aspects of that could be pulled out into policy. Because I think it would be, if it's a significant change, that it's the board that should be making that sort of decision rather than
So, yeah, so I mean, I think really the staff, when we look for trustee direction, this work that's underway could outcome and done could become a policy, or it could be an administrative or a portion of it to your and the structural stuff that we haven't worked on yet around committee structures could go in procedure. Don't have a
Template yet.
But on a template, and from my staff perspective, it's either one that's totally acceptable. At the moment, it's an AP, so it would be
Follow-up, Jennifer?
It's not a follow-up, it's a new question, but thank you so much for sharing this work. It is very exciting, and it sounds like there's been some really steps taken with Musqueam Nation to have the consultation. I was curious. And I also really like the nod to the process of the ongoing process to ensure that we check back in with the community on naming or renaming. So I was curious what the next steps are for the multicultural heritage aspect, so other communities' engagement.
I think that's a really good question. The working group, and again, that's why we're here, to get feedback, but the working group felt very strongly that this particular, and which is why we separated the two, this particular set of considerations was for new schools. So at the moment, the only new school on the horizon is the Harvard. We recognize that in the renaming, the recommendation from the board was broader to look at recognizing broadly women, other multicultural communities within our city. So that's why we separated the two. But again, it's just a recommendation from the working group. But at this point, the working group felt that given our commitment to reconciliation and the fact that there are very few new school opportunities, that the new school naming should focus on the Indigenous reconciliation piece. And the renaming piece will look more broadly at other, the multicultural fabric of. So, but again, we want feedback. That may not be something that you want to hear. That is something that this committee thinks is a good approach.
Alan?
Thank you, through the chair. I appreciate the last three members and their direction with regards to this. And it is an issue that is important. Through the city has a number of committees, the Cultural Communities Advisory Committee, and they also have a naming committee as well. And so they have a lot of conversation that feeds back to the city council. And specifically on this issue, place-based names, there was a full discussion, and it is supported by the city. The Indigenous community is clear in stating that place-based names is the way to go in regards to naming, not naming specific individuals, such as Norma Rose Point, but I still think that's a good one. With respect to if this is a admin procedure or policy, I think this is one where, and along with Janet, Christy Fraser's comments, I'm not sure if parts or full. I think this needs commitment by the board. So I would be supportive of this going to the moving over. And this is the first one I think we've actually asked to move from admin procedure back to policy. So I would be supportive in that direction. I'm not completely clear, and I am supportive of a new school name focus on the Indigenous community. And specifically Cole Harbour is an area of importance, I believe. So I'd be supportive of that. But having said that, how the city handles it, it is a very an issue that requires deep discussion and conversation. So I would be supportive of this going to moving it, and someone would have to tell me how to move this from AP back to policy. But the general idea with regards to place-based names and the naming rather than renaming, I'd be supportive of that direction so far.
So can I try to answer your question? Maybe Secretary Treasurer Green can help us a little bit. The work that's underway now lays a really good foundation, I think, for moving forward, whether this becomes policy or stays in a procedure. I think where we get into that decision has to be made is how that would be adopted and what it would go. So the biggest thing I see is that staff would still be doing the work to bring something forward. What would shift is that the work would come more through this committee, the role of this committee to look at policy versus through the admin procedures working. So that would be the biggest shift, because the intent as an AP would be to go to the admin procedures working first and then to the superintendent for approval. So really the difference, as far as I'm concerned at this point, would be for staff that if these are acceptable, to take away and draft the next part of the policy or admin procedure. And then if it was the direction of the board, the policy, we would report back here for feedback. And then ultimately it would go to the board for decision versus to the superintendent.
So the April 18th meeting would continue, and then it would be coming back to the committee.
My suggestion is that we've had this group engaged, and it would be helpful to get their feedback on the rest of it, certainly, and then to bring it to the board. But in terms of the logistics, I don't know, David, have I missed anything in terms of
No, I don't think you missed anything, but the board does have policy too, does have responsibility for providing direction at the commencement of a naming or renaming process, and the board does have the final approval of the renaming or naming of an educational facility. So the policy statement is already in your board policy number 2. I think what David is trying to say is that the procedures that the naming working group would go through is more of an admin procedure process versus, but I think the board does have the authority in policy to actually provide direction at the beginning of that naming process if they want to change how the process happens. That's how I would interpret that.
I think what I hear, David, though, is that there's a request perhaps from two trustees to take the whole admin procedure and make it a policy. Like make a new policy.
So
With
Is that-
policy.
Maybe we have some clarification
Yeah,
on that.
that's what I think I'm hearing, but I just want to clarify how that works.
So, David spoke to the role of the board that's in policy too. It might be that these naming considerations are taken and put into that piece of policy. It might be that it's a standalone policy. I don't quite know. Yeah, I'm with Alan. This is a new process we're going through. I don't quite know what it look like. Maybe the next step is to come back to the committee with what options we have.
That makes sense, actually. Yeah.
So through the chair, what can I take that away? And I will, like, as we come back, certainly questions of how. Sure.
Yeah, my view is, because I sit on a number of the committees in City Hall, that I'm supporting the direction here. It's just that the input by the trustees, by the board, by the committee members of this committee, I think it warrants that further discussion before it gets implemented. So, and from there, maybe in the future, it goes back to admin procedure rather than policy. But at this stage, I feel that more input, as well as Trustee Reddy's comments with regards to input from other groups as well. Also, I know we're only talking about naming rather than naming and renaming, so I don't want all that loss sort of we're doing one step at a time, but.
Great. Yeah.
Maybe on the next steps could capture some elements of what the renaming, like at a very high level. So it's not, we've spoken to it at the meeting, but it's not in the report. Maybe different people are making different assumptions about what that would look like.
So at the committee, so just to answer, at the working group, we talked about, again, as I said before, we talked about how the belief and the recommendation from that working group, the Indigenous naming embedded in the naming process. We did acknowledge, though, that the initial report was much broader and that we haven't yet done the reaching out to other that, and we said let's try to get naming, and our next steps, and it might next year will be the renaming. That will do it well again. We want to go out and meet different multi, hear from them and engage them in the process. And I don't see. I'd like to get to a point where we've got naming done maybe by the end of this year, and then renaming to next year. That makes sense. I know it's taking a while, but
Just
it's
capture the intent to do that.
Alan?
My hopes are, and I don't want to delay this, the hopes are that City Council, all their advisory committees, I think will be coming on board again pretty soon. And there was a thorough discussion with regards to naming, especially there were individuals that were brought in from the Indigenous community. And rather than for myself or the board to gather information, to get information in the direction or the steps from council, this is one of the important parts that we can share with the council through the Cultural Advisory Committee and their naming committee. Some of the steps we're taking at the same time. So that's another reason why I think that, to keep it sort of at the board level with regards to policy, with regards to that relationship with City Hall.
Sean?
Thank you through the chair. So I'm appreciative of the work that's been done here, and I understand the reason to focus on naming, but some of the feedback that we've heard is that some of the renaming processes that have gone on recently have been a little troubling to the communities that have gone through them. And I'm just kind of wondering if there could be a discussion in terms of the priority of naming and renaming here, because as was said, we're likely to maybe see one naming opportunity in the next few years when the Cohart School is built. And yet there may be schools who are looking to undergo renaming and might want a new process for that sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Sean. Anybody else?
I try to address that.
Sure.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Sean. I think what's happened is this has been a really great but organic, this is the work. And we really wanted to do it well. And it very comfortable and very happy, I think, members report that it's been a process where everyone's voice is heard, and I entirely appreciate what you're saying. Renaming part of that, but the renaming part is significantly more complicated because when you're, and that's why I think it's going to take time because, and we certainly have not held anyone up, and I appreciate the process isn't who's asked now to still go through the current 5-4A around a renaming. But renaming, we now also have to really look at coming back with some thoughtfulness around when is it appropriate to rename as well, and under what kind of guidelines or criteria would we have schools had a name. And I can think of a number of examples that have been quite divisive in some of our school communities trying to agreement to enter into a renaming, because there are people who will be attached to a name and other people who really want to rename. So I'm just trying to say, I acknowledge what you're saying. It's going to take some time, and I think that's when we're going to need to probably do some pretty broad consultation around what are people bringing to the table, and how do we do renaming in a respectful way that allows us to move forward and doesn't disenfranchise. So I'm not trying to stall, it's a big one, so we thought, let's try to get this one done, because in a way it's a bit more simple, because it doesn't have the history of changing, which has another whole dimension to it. So, but yes, to your point, I acknowledge you need to get it up. That doesn't reflect the will of the board right now, and it's a very old process. So, thank you very much.
Just a follow-up to that, if I'm correct, in the past, the renaming has been a community, right? Community driven. Started with the school community. I guess that's the decision we start with. Does it start? Does it just start with the community? Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Our current renaming procedure involves the formation of a committee, but in some ways it doesn't make sense even to have a committee, because it could come straight to the board. Like when I look at it, I don't budget needs some work, because to rename a school as it currently is, you have to first have already received consensus at the school level that everyone is supportive. So really the renaming process to move forward is school A has met PAC, staff, students, others in there, and they've already agreed we want to change the name to this. They've come up with a name, and then the committee is formed at that point, really just to say, yes, we support bring this forward to the board, or no. So I do think that needs a process piece, as well as a how do you do that in a respectful way? Kinds of how do we envision renaming schools?
Okay, thank you very much. Then you got enough there to come back to.
Well, can I ask, sorry, Chair, I'm trying, what I really wanted to go back to me, I'm still entirely clear, and I'm going to assume by people not having big comments on these considerations that these are, because the next step is to take these, regardless of whether it's policy or procedure, and really start to work with them. So what we're looking for now is, are there any big flags with these considerations?
Thank you, through the chair. It's not a flag, actually.
Yeah.
It's just more, all of them obviously are trying to reflect place-based names and honor the community language and the Musqueam people. Number 4, however, when I read it, the if-when part seems jarring to me. And I'm trying to just get a handle on when it wouldn't be, based on all the other considerations that are present. The drafting considerations.
Or number 4.
Yes.
So I'll do my best to answer this, and it's something we certainly, again, we're happy to change. That's why we're here, right? But I think the intent was that we do have place-based names that, although this, and I guess that's where like the direction of this committee too, the intent was to say, we want, I guess, a few things. That moving forward, we want to rename schools after places. In choosing that place-based name, if you're looking for the Musqueam elders to provide input or direction, really the process is very much what unfolded. Is that the committee itself doesn't have a lot of say. I don't mean it that way, but you would go and say, we're looking to provide a name. I'll use the school at Cole Harbour. We want to provide a name for the school at Cole Harbour. Then it would be turned over really at that point to the Musqueam elders to do searches through. Chaz, correct if I said anything wrong, but to look through the history and what they can find, and they would then come up with basically give back to us. So it really is a process where in doing that, we have to give that trust to them to do that. And so I think the intent there was, I guess, there could be a place where you wanted a place that you wouldn't necessarily go through Musqueam. Yes. So, but that's where we'd like feedback. And I would say in our working group, that's the one place where there wasn't. Some of us wanted to say that it always would be an indigenous place-based name, and others wanted to know. So I really, did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, we can speak about Crosstown in particular. When they were consulting with their school community, the school had come up with a selection of 20 different kind of place-based names, but none of them were like historically attached to that actual place in which the school resides on. So when they had me come in, knowing that area, and I kind of knew a little bit of the context of the history, I shared them the story of Sanok, which is the story of the kind of a gathering ground for the Musqueam people and Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish, because before colonization, they were all one family. Reserve systems, they were all one family. So Sanok, before False Creek got filled in, that was their gathering place. So there's a story of that place. And so they had come up with a series of, names, and a lot of them were reflective of, the water and the closeness to the water. And some of them were like totally not appropriate. And I gave my feedback to the school saying, yeah, these were great. I'm going to pass these over now to the elder Larry Grant, because he's the one that does the archives into the history of the place and what he would deem appropriate. So we kind of met in the middle because they had come up with some place-based names that involved water, and Larry had researched the area, knowing the history of that area, was able to come up with what he felt was appropriate, and obviously, taking the kids' ideas into consideration, we were able to come to something that I think everybody felt really comfortable, that kind of reflected the place. And so we're not always going to have that. A place is not always going to have either kind of really strong cultural ties, or maybe not have a significant place-based name. So, but still having the advice of the elders and those who know the history, I think is really important.
Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. Just on that, through the chair, on that item 4, I was suggesting that second part of there, where it says it is important to seek the early involvement, it is necessary to also give a nod to the work that's already been done, which is by necessity working with Musqueam elders. And as a follow-up to that word change of important to necessary, to ensure that elders are being paid for their services, I'm assuming that is happening, but just to ensure that it's not expected to be like a voluntary contribution.
That's a good question because we do not.
Well,
I don't know how that works. Maybe we could take that one. I like the suggestion. I just maybe instead of talking about it here, like, let's, yeah, certainly if that's appropriate. Yeah, we would absolutely take that one away. Yeah, okay, thank you. Never thought of it.
Alan? I never asked directly, but I believe the one from the city, there is someone who's brought in and he is paid. I forgot his name at this stage. But that's his professional role as regards to naming, so that is. But if I may, with regards to point 4 as well, and what Catherine was talking about earlier, especially when Cole Harbor is a school further north of the district. With regards to the Tsleil-Waututh Squamish, I don't know, like with regards to the borders, is it, just asking rather than going in the direction, should we look into whether we should reach out to those other 2 groups as well? And, you know, it's just named here, the Musqueam by itself, so maybe just clarification by the committee how we should handle that, because if it's clearly written like this, just strictly Musqueam, we should look into this a little more.
So through the chair, can I take that away with Chad, because we did run this past month, so we want to be respectful. So I would want to check with them if it's appropriate for us to vote, because we want relationships. So I want to go to the other 2 groups that I just want.
Yeah, I think it would be, we have been primarily focusing on, not to say that we have reached out to Squamish, so we're building relationships there. And that's something that we can prove Musqueam, we can get that information and seek that guidance.
Whatever is most respectful.
Thank you.
Louis.
I'm wondering if you could look at formalizing a way to, I don't know what the word is, not to like commemorate a process or like, not necessarily honoring the past name necessarily, but some way to document and to have it. I don't want it to seem like we're trying to change or erase history if it's something that was like, maybe it's not a name that doesn't serve us anymore, but explain why that is. So have something, a process, I guess, in place so that we're still owning what was there before. Do I make sense?
Chair, I'll take that away. I think that will be very important in our meeting. There is an honoring of the past April movement. So that won't fit in here, but certainly for our.
Okay, yes.
Unless, of course, the reason that community wants to change the name is because they don't want to honor that. I'm thinking, well, let's take McDonald Elementary, which has changed its name. It's not named after John A. McDonald. It's named after William McDonald, who was Stewart Tobacco. And I mean, I can't imagine almost a worse name for a school, right? Except we did get a grant every year. So, you know, that may be the reason why they want the change.
Good comment. Thank you.
I still think it's important to own that though, and just, I mean, not to honor the, I don't know, call it mistake, or not to honor, someone that you no longer want to honor, but just to say, yeah, we did this, and this is the reason for changing it now.
Coming back to number 4, I think the wording, Sean said, I think maybe the wording doesn't clearly reflect the intent. And I think from when Kaz described the process at Crosstown, I think the key piece is collaboration, and that could take place in different ways for different situations, and not to close down options this, but to keep options open.
I think you have a lot of
Yeah, I
information
can
to go
take
back to
that
the
back to
committee.
you.
And okay, I think we'll move on to the, thank you very much for all your comments. Those are very, very helpful. For the 4 items for approval, David Green, you're on for board policy. Policy 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, report in your agenda package that speaks to a proposed amendment to policy 8, board committees. And the reference to our strategic plan is in goal 4, provide effective leadership, governance, and stewardship. And when we speak to the objectives in that goal, we talk about supporting effective communication, engagement, and community partnerships. So, as you know, the board adopted its new policy handbook last September. And this report does contain a recommendation to make a change to policy 8 with respect to the time period in which persons who wish to make a delegation to a standing committee have to make that request. To provide some background, there is an inconsistency in the section of policy 8 on delegations to standing committees. In the version that was adopted by the board, the 3rd bullet in that section states the request and all supporting material must be received at the Education Center at least 3 days prior to the regularly scheduled date of the committee meeting. However, at the end of that section, there's another statement that says a committee chair may waive the notice period, and in brackets it says the request and all supporting material must be received at the Education Center at least 4 days prior to the day of the committee meeting, if the committee chair considers the matter to be an urgent item. So there's an inconsistency in the wording. One section talks about 3 days prior to the meeting, the other section talks about 4 days prior to the meeting. As it's been, my responsibility to take delegation requests, they come through the Secretary Treasurer's office. There has been, the conflicts have arisen, since we adopted this process, in the sense that conflicts have arisen in the application of policy. There is no clear deadline defined in the policy as to what those dates mean. So when we look at the way that standing committee meeting agendas are prepared, they're prepared and sent out on Fridays prior to the meeting date. And it's reasonable to expect, therefore, that any material that would be going out in the agenda, including the listing of delegations, would be included in that agenda. Recognizing also that the committee chair does have the right to approve something later if he or she determines it to be urgent. So the proposed change is listed as an appendix to this report. So it's proposing that the request and all supporting material for delegation must be received at the Education Center no later than noon, 3 business days prior to the regularly scheduled meeting of the committee. So in other words, 3 business days prior to the regularly scheduled meeting is Friday. And at the end, we would also say the same thing, that the committee chair may waive the notice requirement. And in brackets, the request and all supporting material must be received at the Education Center no later than noon, 3 business days prior to the day of the committee meeting. So, Mr. Chair, the recommendation in your package is that those changes be adopted by the committee and recommended to the board for approval.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't, it's not seeing people popping their hands up. Jennifer?
Thanks, through the chair. Yeah, I think that's a really great idea for that, for the third bullet down, the change to no later than noon 3 business days prior, and that would help with the Monday meetings so that we're not receiving things on Friday, for example, so there's no time to prepare. I was just thinking though, since that bullet also at the last sentence says, in exceptional circumstances, the chair in consultation with the assigned staff member may waive the 3 business day notice requirement, that maybe because of that point, you don't need the second to last one, because then it sounds like there is, like, for example, the second to last one says, a committee chair may waive the notice requirement, brackets, the request and all supporting materials must be received at the education center no later than noon 3 business days to the day of the committee meeting, close bracket, if the committee chair considers the matter to be urgent. So it feels like it's already covered in your above edit, that you may not need that second to last one, because it also suggests that if there is an urgent request, you'd still need the materials 3 days in advance, 3 business days in advance.
Not sure I followed what you said, trustee Ray.
Sure, yeah, I can go through it. So the third bullet from the top says the request and all supporting material must be received at the education center. So because the last sentence there says in exceptional circumstances, the notice, the chair, right, may waive the 3-day notice requirement. So then the second last one says the same thing, but that the material should be received 3 days prior. So they sort of conflict
saying
each other, so I would
it's
remove the
redundant.
second. It's redundant, yeah, it kind of cancels itself out of it. Right,
Covered in the
entirely,
third.
yeah, because you already mentioned in the third, but if we think it's important, if we think it's important to have the waiver in exceptional circumstances, maybe it can just mimic what that third bullet from the top says. That in exceptional circumstances, the chair in consultation with the assigned staff member may waive. It's small.
Mr.
but-
Chair, I'm happy to have that second last bullet removed, as long as the third bullet in the section is approved, by the committee and the board.
Sean? Through the chair, just to trustee Reddy's point, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, your request is just to remove everything that's in parentheses there. Is that correct?
You could do, that's another, I was thinking that too, that to, from the bottom bullet, just to remove the brackets, absolutely, then it would match the third bullet from the top. But the other alternative is to just remove it altogether because it's already covered in bullet 3. So it may just be confusing for somebody. Yeah, either way.
Yeah, is it the will of the committee to remove that now? Okay, I agree. Okay, so then that's, we'll just. Sounds good. Thank you very much for your hand on, yes,
Still on this report?
yes,
It might be helpful to say, to add, for meetings on for Wednesday meetings, this will be Friday at noon, just to be,
pinpoint clear. Just
I'm actually gonna say I don't, that would be helpful in policy, because then if meetings change not on Wednesdays, it's confusing and you'd have to come back through the committee to make that minor change. So I think my recommendation, having seen policies and how challenges, that I would stick with 3-day business days, because that's
too hard.
Yeah.
if it's been a Tuesday, it's still 3 days. That's just my.
That's a good point, well taken. Sean, did you have?
I'm actually agreeing with David.
You got enough? You got enough there? So then do we have to, the recommendation?
Recommended the Policy and Governance Committee by consensus recommend to the Board of Education approval of changes to Policy 8, Board Committees regarding delegations to standing committees. So that's the recommendation. I can write up a different reading if you wish.
Yeah, I think this is safe to go forward, so and have the new and, language in there, that'd be great. Okay, thank you very much. Is there any information requests from anybody? Okay, the date and time of the next meeting is May 8th, Wednesday, 5 p.m. Thank you very much.